George was present at the Battle of Consorbrücke in the late summer of that year and participated in several more campaigns in 1676 and 1677. In 1679, he was granted the title of Duke of Hanover, a clear indication of his position as the primary heir to his father. With this title, he was dispatched to England in 1680 to visit the court of King Charles II and to spend some time at Oxford, where he was awarded an honorary degree. Whether or not tentative marriage negotiations were initiated for George to wed King Charles's niece, Anne, remains a subject of debate. In any case, they ultimately yielded no results if they did occur. Upon his return to Germany after his English sojourn, an arrangement was made for George to marry his first cousin, Sophia Dorothea, the daughter of his uncle Georg William. This union was conceived as a means of preventing the fragmentation of the family lands and to secure George's future financial stability by uniting Hanover with the Celle lands controlled by his uncle. It was hardly an ideal foundation for a marriage and would ultimately lead to tragedy for her many years later. In the short term, it resulted in offspring after their marriage in November 1682, with George being 22 years old and his bride just 16. A son named George Ludwig was born almost precisely 1 year after the marriage. Their second and last child, a daughter named Sophia Dorothea after her mother, was born 4 years later in 1687. Many years hence, she would marry Prince Frederick William of Prussia, a marriage that produced a child named Frederick, who would become Frederick II. Thus, George was the grandfather of the Prussian ruler who became known as Frederick the Great, the individual responsible for Prussia's emergence as a major European power in the 18th century. Not long after his marriage to Sophia Dorothea, George became involved in one of the most significant events in early modern European history, though one that is largely forgotten today. For 3 centuries, since the late 14th century, the Ottoman Turks had been steadily expanding their control over the Balkans, and their empire eventually grew to encompass the Levant and most of North Africa as well, meaning that Ottoman fleets held sway over much of the Mediterranean Sea. Since the 1520s, they had controlled the majority of Hungary and other parts of the Carpathian Basin. Now in 1683, the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman government, Kara Mustafa Pasha, attempted to seize the city of Vienna from the Austrian Habsburgs and laid siege to the Austrian capital with an army of 150,000 men. The city was relatively under-defended and would undoubtedly have fallen to the Turks had a grand alliance of Christian states in Central Europe not been forged by John III Sobieski, King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. Hanover contributed to the relief effort, and George journeyed to campaign near Vienna, participating in the momentous Battle of Vienna on the 12th of September, 1683, a clash that resulted in a Christian victory and halted Ottoman expansion into Central Europe. The brothers continued to campaign against the Turks periodically in the ensuing years, as a coalition of Christian states in Central Europe became determined to push back the Ottoman Empire and ensure it never again posed a threat to Vienna. Eventually, in 1791, George's brother Frederick would meet his end while on campaign. By that time, however, the possibility of George and Frederick dividing the Hanoverian dominions between them had vanished. Much to Frederick's dismay in the mid-1680s, their father had decreed that henceforth Hanover would adhere to the principle of primogeniture and that all of his lands would consequently pass to George upon his demise, provided his eldest son was still living at that time. This was a considerably delayed decision in Europe, where virtually every other major power had adopted primogeniture centuries earlier. Not long after Frederick's passing, the political significance of the state George would one day inherit increased substantially. Since the mid-14th century, there had typically been 7 prince-electors within the Holy Roman Empire, who elected the Holy Roman Emperor whenever that office became vacant. These were the King of Bohemia, the Duke of Saxony, the Margrave of Brandenburg, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, and the Prince Archbishops of Mainz, Cologne, and Trier. During the 30 Years' War, the Count Palatine of the Rhine had been briefly replaced by the Duke of Bavaria as a reward for Duke Maximilian I's loyalty to the Austrian Habsburgs. When the war concluded, the Count Palatine was reinstated, increasing the number of electors to 8. This created a voting dilemma, as an even number of electors could become deadlocked with an equal division of votes between 2 different candidates. Thereafter, there were growing calls for a 9th elector to be added, calls that became even more pronounced from 1685 onward after Philip William of Neuburg became Count Palatine of the Rhine. Philip William was a Catholic, and his accession disrupted the religious balance of the Electoral College. Thus, in 1692, George's father was admitted as the ninth Prince Elector, officially known as the Elector of Hanover. George would one day inherit this title and was now clearly among the foremost political heirs in Central Europe. By the time George's father was elevated to the position of Elector of Hanover, a controversy was brewing at the Hanoverian court. George and his wife's marriage had never been particularly close, but it became even more strained in the latter half of the 1680s as he spent an increasing amount of time away from Hanover, campaigning against the Turks and attending to other duties. By the early 1690s, their mutual indifference had transformed into contempt, and George took a mistress by the name of Erengard Melusine von der Schulenberg in 1691. They would eventually have 3 illegitimate daughters together, the first born in January 1692. Sophia responded in kind, and in 1692 she began an affair with Philip Christoph von Königsmarck, a Swedish nobleman and military officer in the Hanoverian army. Their discretion was lacking, and by 1694 the affair had begun to cause such a scandal at the Hanoverian court that a group of courtiers murdered von Königsmarck that summer. George was not directly involved in the act, although he likely had knowledge of the plan. Several months later, George and Sophia's marriage was dissolved as Sophia refused to live with George following the murder of her lover. She was subsequently sent to what amounted to house arrest at Alden House in Lüneburg and would spend the next 3 decades there until her death in 1726, a harsh fate. Yet she did little to improve her situation by becoming a focus of conspiracies within the Hanoverian dominions for years to come. George would continue his relationship with Melusine for the rest of his life. But they never married, and he also had other mistresses at various points. While George was in his late 20s, developments seemingly unrelated to him were unfolding several hundred kilometers to the west of Hanover in England, events that would have a profound impact on his later life and the lives of his descendants. In 1685, King Charles II of England, Scotland, and Ireland passed away without a legitimate heir, despite fathering over a dozen illegitimate children. He was succeeded by his brother, James, Duke of York. The accession of King James II proved highly problematic, as he was a Roman Catholic in a country that had become firmly Protestant over the preceding century and a half. It was not long before his heavy-handed style of governance and his religious beliefs led to a coup, and in 1688, the Glorious Revolution took place. Through this, James was deposed in favor of his Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband, William of Orange. Mary II and William III did not have any children, and so following Mary's death in 1694 and William's in 1702, the throne passed to Mary's sister, Queen Anne of France. Anne's accession did not guarantee a straightforward line of succession either. Despite having numerous pregnancies, at least 14, Anne had a difficult reproductive history, and virtually all of her children were either lost during pregnancy or died before reaching their second birthday. In the summer of 1700, her only remaining child, 11-year-old Prince William, died. There was now no clear successor to Anne in the eyes of England's Protestants, who refused to entertain the possibility of the old King James's Catholic son, who resided in exile in France, succeeding Anne one day. All of this had implications for George, as the House of Hanover was related to the English royal House of Stuart from regaining the throne upon Anne's death. With this, it became evident that George might be the most likely successor to Anne. There was precedent for a foreigner succeeding to the English throne in this manner. After all, George's great-grandfather, King James I, was a Scotsman who had ascended to the English throne back in 1603 by virtue of being the great-great-grandson of King Henry VII of England, the founder of the Tudor dynasty in 1485. George's father passed away in late January 1698. With this, George ascended as Prince Elector of Hanover at the age of 37, inheriting the associated titles of Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg and Prince Bishop of Osnabrück. Over the subsequent decade and a half, much of his focus would be directed towards the War of the Spanish Succession, during which a grand alliance comprising Britain, Austria, the Dutch Republic, and smaller German states such as Hanover sought to prevent a member of the French royal family from inheriting the Spanish throne following the extinction of the direct Habsburg royal line there in 1700, with the death of King Charles II. Hanover was among the less significant participants in the war, which was waged from 1701 to 1714, yet it remained an important partner of the British, fighting against some of the pro-French German states such as Bavaria and Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel. Throughout the conflict, George was an active war leader, personally participating in most campaigns. His abilities as a general were considerable, and in 1707 he was offered the position of imperial field marshal within the Holy Roman Empire. Ultimately, Hanover was one of the few states that emerged favorably from the war after sheer exhaustion led to the signing of peace treaties in 1713 and 1714. Its position as the ninth elector of the Holy Roman Empire was acknowledged by all parties, and it gained some territories at the expense of its smaller neighbors like Wolfenbüttel. Another primary issue that would concern George during his time as Elector of Hanover was the Great Northern War. In the 16th century, numerous powers had risen in Northern and Eastern Europe, becoming rivals for dominance over the Baltic Sea in the Baltic States region surrounding modern-day Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. The three main players were the Kingdom of Sweden, Tsarist Russia, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, with the dual monarchy of Denmark-Norway also playing a role, and some of the smaller North German states occasionally being drawn into the conflicts. Wars had occurred periodically. However, all previous conflicts were overshadowed by the clash that erupted in 1700. The Great Northern War was initiated by Peter the Great of Russia in an effort to end Sweden's dominance over the Baltic Sea and to secure a Baltic seaport for Russia, as the region around modern-day St. Petersburg was under Swedish control at that time. Russia found allies in Warsaw and Copenhagen among the Poles, Lithuanians, and Danes, while numerous other powers from around Europe would be drawn in from time to time in a conflict that would span 21 years. George consistently sympathized with the Russian cause. In evaluating this stance, it's important to consider that Sweden in the 17th century had gained control over much of the Baltic coastline of northern Germany, extending from around Mecklenburg eastward into Pomerania. With Hanover's land situated just to the south, anything that weakened the Swedes could potentially benefit Hanover. Consequently, George informally allied himself with Russia, the Poles, and the Danes, although he did not formally enter the war for many years. Indeed, the Russian victory at the Battle of Poltava in 1709 seemed to have brought the war to an end with a Swedish defeat. But in 1715, King Charles IX of Sweden returned home after years in exile and reignited the conflict. At this point, George decided to fully enter the war on the side of Russia and Peter the Great's other allies, hoping to gain territory in the eventual peace negotiations. In the years that followed, George contributed tens of thousands of troops to the war in Northern Europe, as Charles X attempted to re-establish Swedish dominance over the Baltic and to conquer Norway from the Danes. His death at the Siege of Fredrikstad in November 1718 largely brought matters to a close, and the new Swedish government quickly sought to end the Great Northern War. George benefited immensely from the difficult situation the Swedes were in, and through the Treaty of Stockholm, signed in November 1719, his negotiators secured the duchies of Bremen and Verden in northern Germany as spoils of war. Throughout the time that Hanoverian troops were engaged in fighting the Swedes, George was directing their activities from England rather than Germany. On the 1st of August 1714, George's cousin Queen Anne passed away. Her death occurred 8 weeks after that of George's own mother, Sophia, at the age of 83. Consequently, the path was clear for George to succeed Anne as King of Britain and Ireland. Extensive preparations had been made before Anne's death to ensure the succession of the House of Hanover and to prevent the Catholic son of the deposed King James II in France from attempting to pursue his claim to the throne. Thus, in an era before any form of telecommunications, George had already been proclaimed King of Britain and Ireland in London long before he even knew that Anne had died. Several days would pass before he learned of these events, and then it took several weeks for the necessary arrangements to be made for him to travel to England and enter London as the new monarch. Subtle indications of his accession were visible in the royal documentation associated with the succession, with the new king signing documents using the anglicized version of his name, George with an E, rather than the German Georg without an E, within days of ascending to the throne. George landed at Greenwich near London on the 18th of September 1714, accompanied by a large entourage of German nobles and courtiers, including his mistress and his children. 2 days later, the royal procession entered London around midday, proceeding slowly through the capital over several hours so that the city's over 500,000 inhabitants had the opportunity to witness their new monarch in an age when the physical presence of the king and his image on coins were the primary means of projecting royal authority into the public sphere. All things considered, it was a relatively smooth transition of power, given the various factors involved and the potential for instability in a country where many people were distinctly unhappy with the prospect of a German dynasty becoming the royal family, regardless of their connection to the House of Stuart. Matters were further complicated by the fact that George arrived in England unable to speak the language of his subjects. Although he could converse in French with many individuals in government and within the nobility, as this was the lingua franca of European court society in the 17th and 18th centuries, nevertheless, it did not present a favorable image for a man who was either fully or partially proficient in German, French, Latin, Dutch, and Italian, to have not bothered to begin learning English years earlier in anticipation of becoming King of Britain. While the Hanoverian succession had been implemented with few issues in London when George and his court arrived in September, signs of discontent were more pronounced elsewhere. In August 1715, they launched a short-lived rebellion in the Scottish Highlands. It proved relatively easy to suppress by the end of the year, although corresponding revolts had been planned in Scotland and in parts of England around Bristol and along the southern ports. Had the Jacobite uprising been better organized, and had the Dutch not dispatched thousands of troops to Britain on short notice to honor the terms of a treaty signed with the English government during Anne's reign, through which they had pledged to assist in ensuring George's smooth ascension to the throne, events might have unfolded very differently. As it happened, George's regime weathered this initial scare with relative ease. The political system in the country George had come to rule differed significantly from what he was accustomed to in Hanover. Hanover remained an autocratic principality where the elector prince governed in conjunction with ministers and bureaucrats whom he personally selected. Britain, in contrast, was already well on its way to becoming a fully fledged modern constitutional monarchy. The civil wars of the 1640s and the Glorious Revolution of 1688 had diminished the power of the monarchy and strengthened Parliament, the latter being a nearly permanently sitting body that governed the nation and its affairs. However, the senior officers of state were still chosen by the monarch rather than being elected, although they needed to command a degree of parliamentary support to remain in office. While nearly all of these constitutional changes had occurred during the Stuart era, George holds his own place in British political history as the monarch under whom the concept of a modern prime minister emerged. In the late 1710s, he faced increasing pressure from the parliamentary House of Commons to appoint Robert Walpole, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, as the head of the administration. George was initially not in favor of this idea. Nevertheless, following a financial crisis in 1720, he eventually conceded, and Walpole became the de facto Prime Minister of Britain in 1721. He would hold that office for the subsequent 21 years until 1742, becoming the longest-serving Prime Minister in British history as well as the first. While Walpole did dominate the government from 1721 onward, George was not averse to playing a role in British political affairs. He had demonstrated this in 1717 when he advocated for the agreement known as the Triple Alliance. This alliance was agreed upon between Britain, the Dutch Republic, and France, and it represented a significant shift in European politics. For decades, since the outbreak of the Franco-Dutch War in 1672, England and the Dutch had generally been in conflict with France. The death of King Louis XIV in 1715 paved the way for a realignment that would prevent the near-constant state of war that had existed between 1672 and 1714. With the Franco-Dutch War, the 9 Years' War, and the War of the Spanish Succession having embroiled Western and Central Europe in conflict for 28 of those 42 years. The alliance was also formed as a means of signaling to Spain, which felt betrayed by the losses it had sustained at the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, not to seek a new war with the hope of French assistance. The Triple Alliance of 1717 was more of a non-aggression pact than a full military alliance, but it was effective nonetheless. In contrast to his time as Elector of Hanover, George's reign as King of Great Britain was notably peaceful, with no major wars engulfing Europe again until the War of the Austrian Succession broke out in 1740. Other issues arose during George's reign concerning his relationship with certain political groups in England. One such issue pertained to religion and his stance towards the Church of England. George was a Lutheran, a moderate form of Protestantism. On the surface, this presented few problems, but England had a complex religious landscape, where Protestants were not simply united in opposition to Catholics. There were both moderate and radical forms of Protestantism, with Anglicans who adhered to the Church of England representing the more moderate wing, while others favored Calvinism or Puritanism, as it was known in England. Both sides harbored fears that George would prove either too moderate or too radical. Ultimately, he navigated these divisions by adopting a middle ground approach, favoring a politique stance on religion, the primary objective of which was to avoid religious controversy of any kind. Catholicism was viewed as the adversary in George's perspective, and thus he aimed to lessen religious tensions among Protestants. In other matters, particularly concerning Parliament, George was compelled to make concessions in the form of the Peerage Bill of 1719. This piece of legislation was introduced to halt the creation of new peers or nobles due to a general concern that an excessive number of Germans were being granted British noble titles following the Hanoverian succession. The Peerage Bill was directed as much at the Prince of Wales as it was at the King himself. George's son, the future King George II, possessed a strong personality and endeavored to play a role in British political life during the initial years of his father's reign in Britain. This soon led to conflict between father and son, a relationship that had always been strained. Matters reached a critical point in 1717 regarding the arrangements for the baptism of the Prince of Wales's son, George's grandson, Prince George William. The ceremony devolved into an argument between the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Newcastle, culminating in a challenge to a duel. Annoyed by this public display of impulsiveness by his son, a rift developed between the king and the prince, one that persisted well into 1718. They were eventually reconciled to some extent, but the relationship between George and his heir remained perpetually strained. It proves challenging to fully grasp the character of the man who was overseeing this transition in British government. Historians have generally regarded George as one of the most elusive and secretive of all the country's monarchs. Contradictions existed within his persona. For instance, his correspondence with his daughter Sophia Dorothea reveals a loving parent. Conversely, his treatment of his wife, Sophia's mother, was appalling. Similar contradictions were evident in his role as monarch. His failure to learn to speak English before Anne's death, coupled with the sporadic manner in which he subsequently acquired some of the language, seems to indicate a lack of concern for the opinions of his British subjects. At the same time, however, evidence suggests that when he did begin to improve his English in the 1720s, it was with the intention of understanding how he was being portrayed in English newspapers. He was socially awkward and never felt entirely comfortable in his position as the head of a large royal court. Yet in more relaxed private settings with friends, he could be remarkably informal for a monarch, favoring risque jokes and exhibiting considerable self-deprecation. One thing remains certain: he was not, as some earlier generations of historians had depicted him, an unintelligent man. No ruler lacking in intellect could have managed the Hanoverian succession as successfully as he did. Although not naturally inclined to be a sociable individual, George made an effort to become a more publicly visible ruler in England than he had been in Hanover. This was to foster a closer connection with his new subjects and mitigate the chances of further revolts like those that had already marked the first year of his reign. A notable aspect of this was the public feasts he hosted. At one of the more prominent royal residences of the 18th century, Hampton Court. During the summer months, he would invite dozens of guests to these feasts held on the grounds of the estate. Furthermore, even more individuals would be invited to visit the gardens, where George would stroll in the evenings, engaging with his subjects and listening to their petitions. Through these interactions and his own efforts, he gradually began to learn English. The extent of his fluency has been debated, but government documents from the 1720s, years after his arrival in England, demonstrate that he had achieved a certain level of reading comprehension in English by that time. He also presided over regular hunting excursions to which members of England's nobility and political and economic communities were invited. Spending on his court was substantial and was aimed at winning over the political classes in England, thereby solidifying the status of the Hanoverian dynasty as the new royal family. It must be acknowledged that George's court did not offer patronage to many great thinkers. This, however, was somewhat of a coincidental occurrence due to the era. It simply happened that numerous prominent academics and artistic figures within British society had either passed away or were in the final stages of their lives when George ascended to the throne. John Locke, the renowned philosopher and essayist, had died in 1704. Christopher Wren, the brilliant architect who oversaw the reconstruction of London following the Great Fire of 1666, was still alive, although his most significant accomplishments were behind him when George arrived in England, and Wren died in 1723. Isaac Newton, the father of modern physics and one of the most accomplished scientists in human history, was retained as Master of the Royal Mint by George, though he was already in his 70s at the time of the Hanoverian succession, and his most groundbreaking work was in the past. Others, such as the poet Alexander Pope, who were at the peak of their careers, were satirists of the royal court. While George did not have a Wren, Locke, or Newton in their prime to patronize, he did support the London theaters in the cultural sphere, with the Haymarket Theatre opening its doors in the capital in 1720. The king frequented the London theaters when productions of French plays by playwrights such as Molière, Corneille, and Racine were being staged, his limited understanding of English reducing his inclination towards English playwrights. If there was one brilliant cultural figure associated with George's court in England, it was undoubtedly the composer George Frederick Handel. Born in Halle, Germany in 1685, Handel had honed his skills in Germany and Italy before relocating to London in 1712 at the invitation of Charles Montague, the first Duke of Manchester. He was still residing there when George succeeded to the throne in 1714, a fortunate turn of events as Handel had briefly served as Kapellmeister, or Master of the Choir, in Hanover in 1710 under George's employment as Elector of Hanover. Over the next 3 decades, he would compose an enormous body of operas and librettos in England, emerging as arguably the greatest England-based composer of the Baroque and classical eras of Western music, and the only figure associated with the Hanoverian court who could rival composers like Johann Sebastian Bach and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart on the continent in the 18th century. George supported some of Handel's work, and many of his operas premiered at the King's Theatre in London during the 1720s. Surely one of George's most significant, though often overlooked, accomplishments was the manner in which he furthered the expansion of Britain's burgeoning empire. When he ascended to the throne, England had already established colonies in numerous regions. By that time, the initial English colonies founded in Virginia and New England in the early 17th century had been expanded through the granting of new charters to prospective colonists and through war with the Dutch to secure New Netherland, which was seized and renamed New York. This resulted in an unbroken string of colonies stretching from New Hampshire in the north down to the Carolinas in the south. In the Caribbean, there were numerous prosperous sugar plantation colonies on islands such as Jamaica, Barbados, and smaller enclaves like St. Kitts and Nevis. Elsewhere, while England possessed only a few coastal footholds in India, its commercial activities there were expanding under the auspices of the English East India Company. This provided a substantial foundation to build upon. George's reign witnessed a modest yet important expansion of this colonial activity. One notable aspect of this, which still influences the geography and administration of the United States 3 centuries later, was the establishment of a new colony in the region, situated south of the Carolinas and north of the Spanish presence in Florida. Colonists had begun settling here to evade the jurisdiction of either the Carolina or Virginia colonial governments in the late 17th century. But the expansion into the area accelerated in the 1710s and 1720s. George's government encouraged and began preparations to establish a new proprietary colony there. Although it would be a few years after his death before this was finalized, it was named Georgia and would eventually become the modern-day U.S. state bearing the same name. In other areas, a British colony on the island of Newfoundland, in what is now eastern Canada, which had been established during the later stages of Queen Anne's reign, was expanded by George's government. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, the Bahamas became a British crown colony in the 1720s after George's government had engaged in an extensive campaign to suppress the pirates operating there in the latter half of the 1710s. In other respects, George's reign set more nefarious precedents. The 1710s and 1720s saw a considerable increase in Britain's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade, and the king himself benefited immensely from this trade. George's profits from the slave trade accrued primarily from his position as governor of. Economic bubbles had already occurred in the history of nascent European capitalism, most notably the tulip mania in the Dutch Republic back in the 1630s. But this marked the first instance of such a large-scale bubble in England. Although it was a newly formed company that had not yet generated any profits, when shares in the South Sea Company were offered in London in the late 1710s. A frenzy to acquire them began. The resulting bubble was amplified by the board members who exaggerated the extent of the anticipated profits. Consequently, between later 1719 and May 1720, the price of shares soared from just over $100 to $600, eventually reaching nearly £1,000 per share for a few days that summer. Then it all collapsed, and during 1721, shares plummeted back to below $100. The South Sea Company did not go bankrupt and continued to function as a valuable joint stock company until the mid-19th century, exploiting industries such as whaling in the South Atlantic. However, the South Sea bubble of 1720 ruined the personal finances of many individuals. Incredibly, even before the bubble burst, Georgia's government had already passed the Bubble Act in June 1720, a piece of legislation intended to prevent further economic bubbles of the kind that was still in progress. Bizarrely, even as the government was legislating against it, speculators continued to invest in the bubble. Beyond these colonial endeavors, George's reign witnessed a reaffirmation of what is often termed the blue water policy in Britain's imperial history. This was an unwritten principle of English foreign and military policy that prioritized the Royal Navy as the most effective means of expanding Britain's empire abroad and safeguarding Britain against all enemies at home in Europe. A policy of this nature could be said to have originated as early as the reign of Elizabeth I in the latter half of the 16th century. However, successive reigns saw it reinforced, notably through the professionalization of the Royal Navy in the 17th century. The Hanoverians, beginning with George III, provided fresh impetus to this policy, and over the course of the next century and a half, Britain would emerge as the preeminent global superpower, based almost entirely on the strength of its navy and its dominance of the world's oceans. That process was already well underway during George's reign. The manner in which British naval power was employed in the 1720s to curb Spain's efforts to retake Gibraltar and Minorca, which it had lost during the War of the Spanish Succession, underscored how effective British sea power would serve as the cornerstone of a successful foreign policy moving forward in the 18th century. One part of Britain's empire, the one geographically closest, presented a persistent problem, and George's reign was no exception. This was Ireland. The country had been partially conquered in the 12th and 13th centuries, then fully conquered in the 16th. However, major revolts had occurred there in the 1590s, the 1640s, and the late 1680s, all with the aim of re-establishing the paramount position of the Roman Catholic majority. All of these rebellions had been suppressed and had led to a growing Protestant ascendancy, in which English, Welsh, and Scottish nobles and landlords controlled over 80% of the land, despite constituting only about 15% of the population. Even this Protestant elite posed challenges in the eyes of administrators in London, and in the 1710s, a scandal arose when the Irish House of Lords intervened in the management of the Irish courts. This was viewed as a step too far towards legislative and judicial independence by England, and in 1719, George's government oversaw the passage of the Declaratory Act. Granted royal assent by the king in 1720, it effectively subordinated the Irish Parliament to the English Parliament, and marked an important step towards the eventual abolition of the Irish Parliament in 1800 through the Act of Union, whereby the Irish Parliament was dissolved entirely, and henceforth Irish politicians had to take their seats in the English Parliament at Westminster. Measures like these, which bore George's approval, did not go unchallenged in Ireland. One of the most outspoken critics of the early Hanoverian government's policies was Jonathan Swift. Swift was an Anglo-Irish satirist and writer who also served as the Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. His reputation was already established by the time George ascended to the throne in England in 1714. But it was during George's reign that he penned many of his most famous works, most of which were thinly veiled critiques of crown policy in Ireland. Gulliver's Travels, published in 1726, is the most well-known, but the text that most directly attacked the king and his government was the Drapier's Letters. These were a series of 7 pamphlets published in 1724 and 1725 in response to the granting of a license to produce copper coins in Ireland to William Wood, an ironmonger and manufacturer. The license was highly unorthodox and was only granted to Wood. In 1722, because he had paid a substantial $10,000 bribe to George's long-term mistress and the mother of his younger children, Melusine von der Schulenburg. In attacking Wood and the manner in which he had obtained his license to mint coins by bribing the royal mistress, Swift was taking a significant risk. The texts were published pseudonymously under the name M.B. Drapier, although it was widely known that Swift was the author. Swift only grew more audacious in his satire, Poor Irish Catholics, in which he satirically proposed that children should be sold as food to the wealthy to relieve the Hanoverian state of the cost of providing them with charity. In addition to the numerous overseas territories that George had to manage, he still had the governance of Hanover to oversee. Unlike Britain, Ireland, and the British colonies in North America and the Caribbean, the German lands remained directly under George's control and were not subject to oversight by the British Parliament or George's ministers in England. Although he resided for most of his life after 1714 in England, George returned to Germany periodically, visiting in 1716, 1719, 1723, and again in 1725, with the latter visit extending into early 1726. In total, he spent approximately 2.5 years in Hanover between 1714 and 1727. During one of these visits, of his German dominions was entrusted to administrators such as Andreas Gottlieb von Bemstorff and Hans Caspar von Bothmer, whom George implicitly trusted to manage affairs in his absence. More generally, George was happiest during these years when visiting his homeland, and the role of being King of Britain and Ireland was evidently more of a burden than a desired aspiration for him. George's final years were marked by increasing withdrawal from public life. He allowed Walpole to continue running the government and further distanced himself from day-to-day administration. The few actions he did undertake were characteristic of this. For instance, George is generally credited with establishing the Order of the Bath, one of Britain's highest orders of chivalry, in 1725. Today it is junior only to the Order of the Garter and the Order of the Thistle. However, the new honor was essentially Walpole's creation, as he developed a new distinction that he could use to reward his own allies, and it became a form of patronage offered by him as prime minister rather than by the king as monarch. Elsewhere, the Treaty of Charlottenburg was followed by the Treaty of Hanover in 1725, through which Britain, Hanover, Prussia, and France allied with one another in response to the signing of the Treaty of Vienna months earlier, which had seen Austria and Spain draw closer together. The effects of this were considerable. For decades, Britain had been closely aligned with Austria, but George's reign saw this alliance dissolve in a reorientation towards closer ties with Prussia, the emerging German power. Beyond such political concerns, George spent much of his later years engaging with his growing number of grandchildren. An interesting side note is that in the latter half of 1726, he offered a home in exile to a young Voltaire, the future giant of the French Enlightenment, who had been compelled to leave France after a dispute with the powerful Duc de Rohan. It was in England that Voltaire encountered an environment of liberalism that he later claimed shaped his work for decades to come after his return to France. George was in his mid-60s by the summer of 1727 when he decided to visit Hanover again, having been in England for nearly a year and a half. He had crossed the English Channel and was traveling through the Dutch Republic when he fell ill in mid-June. As the royal entourage halted that evening, he complained of stomach cramps and chest pains, which he initially attributed to indigestion from consuming too much fruit the previous evening. Insisting that they continue their journey, with medical staff attending to him in his carriage, George suffered a stroke early in the morning of the 9th of June. The party hurried to the city of Osnabrück, where George passed away 2 days later on the 11th of June at the age of 67. His remains were taken to Hanover, and he was interred in the Linischloss Palace in his homeland, although he was subsequently reburied at the Herrenhausen Gardens after the Second World War. George was the last reigning British monarch to be buried outside of England, and only one of 6 since the Norman conquest to be so. The others were William the Conqueror, Henry II, and Richard the Fern in the 11th and 12th centuries, James II in France as a result of his deposition in 1688, and Philip II, who was buried in Spain, the realm he governed for decades in the 16th century after the death of his wife Mary Tudor in 1558. As such, George's burial in Germany was a very unusual occurrence for an English monarch. George's reign in many ways laid the groundwork for the massive expansion of the British Empire over the subsequent century. During the reign of his son and successor, King George II, which lasted until 1760, Britain's commercial and colonial interests grew, with the first significant conquests in India in the mid-1750s, around the same time that Britain was displacing the French from Canada. Not long afterward, James Cook would commence his expeditions to the South Seas, the area around which there had been so much speculative investment in George's time, exploring much of the Pacific Ocean and paving the way for British colonization of Australia, New Zealand, and Tasmania. By the time George's great-grandson, King George III, died in 1820, the sun rarely set on the British Empire, and Britain had emerged as the wealthiest nation in the world, the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution and modern capitalism. This transformation was made possible by the non-controversial monarch. His reign was rather uneventful in a sense, especially in comparison to the civil wars and political battles that characterized England's history in the 17th century, or indeed the much more colorful reign of his great-grandson, George III, during whose time the American Revolutionary War was fought, the British Raj was formed, Britain led the resistance to the French Empire of Napoleon Bonaparte, and the Industrial Revolution began. But in a way, what Britain needed in 1714 when George ascended the throne was a steady, perhaps even dull, monarch, one who would oversee the Hanoverian succession without provoking excessive animosity, and who allowed the British political, economic, and colonial system to continue evolving in the manner it had been for decades. This resulted in a growing commercial system and a constitutional monarchy that was beginning to resemble a modern parliamentary democracy. George may not have been a great monarch in the traditional sense, but he was an ideal monarch to establish the Hanoverian dynasty and set Britain on the path to becoming the world's preeminent superpower in the 19th century. What are my thoughts on King George III? Was he, in many respects, Britain's most underappreciated monarch who, in his own unassuming way, stabilized the British state during the Hanoverian succession and subsequently paved the way for Britain's rapid imperial expansion in the 18th and 19th centuries. The individual known throughout history as King George I came into this world on the 28th day of May in the year 1660 within the city of Hanover, situated in north-central Germany, which at that time constituted the Duchy of Brunswick-Luneburg. His father was Ernest Augustus, the Duke of Brunswick-Luneburg. He would later acquire additional titles as the years progressed, most notably that of Prince Bishop of Osnabrück, and of greater significance, the Prince Elector of Hanover, a distinction bestowed upon him in 1692, holding considerable weight within the Holy Roman Empire. George's mother was Sophia of the Palatinate, a substantial principality that held dominion over a significant portion of Western Germany along the course of the Rhine River. She possessed familial connections to numerous prominent ruling families across Europe, particularly in England, Scotland, and Ireland. Her marriage to Ernest Augustus in 1658 was politically motivated and further solidified ties to lineages such as the Danish royal family, to which Ernest Augustus was related. George was their firstborn child. 6 more offspring would follow, 5 additional sons and 1 daughter named Sophia Charlotte, who would eventually become Queen of Prussia through marriage. Among the sons, the younger ones would embark on military careers, given that their prospects of inheriting the Hanoverian titles were realistically non-existent, although George would experience a certain rivalry with his next oldest brother, Frederick Augustus. Frederick entered the world in 1661, and for a considerable portion of his life, there existed a genuine possibility that he would inherit some of the Hanoverian lands. This was because the principle of primogeniture, where the eldest son or daughter in the absence of sons would inherit the entirety of the family estate, had not yet been legally established in Hanover by the latter half of the 17th century. This situation was a holdover from the medieval era, when dominions were frequently divided among several sons. The succession politics of Hanover were not the sole complexity at the time of George's birth. Germany during that era was a perplexing mosaic of political entities. Going back to the High Middle Ages and the late medieval period, Germany had been divided into literally hundreds of distinct political entities, some being large duchies, margravats, principalities, and counties, while others were small free cities and territories. Furthermore, many bishops and other ecclesiastical lords also governed small states themselves. All of these were loosely joined under the umbrella of the Holy Roman Empire, with an emperor elected by 7 electors from among the most powerful German states. However, by the 17th century, the imperial office had become virtually a hereditary title for the Austrian House of Habsburg, A process of centralization had been underway during the 16th and 17th centuries, with many of the smaller states being absorbed by their larger neighbors. Nevertheless, even by the time George was born, there were still well over 100 German states. George's early years were, by all accounts, relatively happy. His mother displayed a degree of affection for him and his siblings that was uncommon among the upper aristocracy of that period. While he was not evidently his parents' favorite, he was regarded as a good eldest child, one who was conscientious, sober, and responsible from a young age, qualities deemed necessary in a political heir. He received his education from the governor and preceptor of the household until his 15th year in 1675, acquiring the ability to speak and write in German, French, and Latin. His primary interests in his early years, however, lay in the pursuits of hunting and riding, and he developed a strong bond with his father through these activities. In that same year of 1675, when his formal schooling concluded, he also commenced his career as a military officer, participating in campaigns alongside his father against the French, allied with the Dutch in the Franco-Dutch War.